You are listening to Chapter 2, Lesson 2 of Form 3 African History. Cameroon General Education. Narrated by Wacheseh Academy. Britain and Indirect Rule. Meaning: this is a British colonial system of governing colonies through their traditional political structures. The African traditional rulers and institutions were used as intermediaries. The traditional rulers and their council, courts, and treasury administered their respective areas with the advice and supervision of British officials. In areas where traditional rulers lacked automatic powers, they appointed artificial chiefs and gave them wider powers. Indirect rule was first introduced in northern Nigeria by Lord Lugard. He strongly defended this system of administration in his book, The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa. By preserving African traditional institutions and using African traditional rulers in the colonial administration, the colonial rule will become beneficial to the Africans and the British. Why Lugard introduced indirect rule system in northern Nigeria by 1906. Shortage of personnel to adopt the direct rule. The shortage was made worse by the Boer War, high mortality rate caused by tropical climate and diseases, constant ill health of British officials, influenced the people to rule indirectly. Shortage of funds. Colonies were poor to support the cost of direct rule. It was economic wise to use traditional rulers. Language problems. It was difficult for British officials to communicate with people who don't speak the same language as them. The existence of a well-organized, highly centralized traditional system of government. They had the alkali court, native treasury, etc. that made it easier for the British to rule the people through traditional rulers. Poorly developed transport infrastructure and transport facilities made it easier for the British to rule the people through traditional rulers rather than British straining on footpaths, donkeys, etc. The people lived in the scattered vast environments under traditional rulers. This made it difficult to rule millions of people directly. The British were snobbish, and they regarded the people as primitive and wild, so preferred a system that will avoid direct contact with the people. How Lugard introduced the policy. Northern Nigeria was divided into 12 provinces, and each province was headed by a British resident. The chief resident was stationed in the headquarters of the Sultan of Sokoto. The British retained the Fulani emirs and chief in their position as the governing class. The British administrative officers such as residents, district officers merely acted as political advisors to the emirs and chief. The emirs continued to perform their legislative, executive, and judicial functions. The Akali courts and emir courts acted as the judiciary. The emirs were allowed to collect taxes for the emirate treasury. The emirs were not allowed to maintain their military forces. The emirs were compelled to obey the orders of the governor and those from the colonial office in London. What were the main features of indirect rule? Traditional rulers were retained as the governing class. Where the people lacked traditional rulers or rulers with autocratic rulers and gave them wider powers. The British administrative officers acted as political advisors and supervisors. Traditional rulers continued to perform their legislative, executive, and judicial functions. The native courts were allowed to pass judgment, but the British regulated punishment and prevented abuse of power. Traditional rulers collected taxes and kept them in the native treasury. Traditional rulers were compelled to obey the orders of the governor and those from the colonial office in London. The traditional rulers were no longer allowed to maintain their military forces. Why indirect rule succeeded in the north of Nigeria. Lugard worked long in the north between the period of 1900 to 1906. He had a good mastery of the environment. They had powerful traditional rulers, well-organized centralized system of administration. The north had an organized system of taxation. The Islamic religion gave the emirs a lot of authority to rule the people. Illiteracy and ignorance were very high in the north. The level of political awareness in the north was too low. The British did not encourage Christianity to spread to the north. Why did the people of southern Nigeria, western and eastern Nigeria react negatively to the indirect rule system of administration? Why did it fail in southern Nigeria? The colonial government made the mistake of appointing warrant chiefs against tradition. The Yorubas in the west and Igbos in the east did not have a highly centralized administration like the north. The colonial government made the mistake of appointing artificial chiefs or warrant chiefs, and these chiefs were power-drunk and exercised powers against tradition, causing confusion. Taxation was not known or popular in the west and east like in the north. So when introduced, brought problems. Christianity had been allowed to spread easily in southern Nigeria. This influenced the new Christian converts to disobey their pagan rulers publicly. Indirect rule was seen by the elites as a British trick to delay rapid constitutional development, and early chiefs were not prepared for independence. Indirect rule was used to straighten the policy of divide and rule hates by the elites because it divided the traditional rulers and Western-educated elite who were not traditional rulers. The system made their chiefs to become British stooges and puppets. They represented the British more than their subjects. The British were using their chiefs to do dirty jobs like supervision of grass cutting under the rain, etc., which made the elites hate the British. Merits. It recognized the authorities of traditional rulers, which helped to force their subjects to respect them. The system helped to train the traditional rulers in the act of modern governance, and that helped to modernize the pre-colonial system of government. It helped to preserve African traditional culture and institutions, since the British respected the traditions and customs of the people. It reduced the cost of colonial administration, and that made the people pay very low taxes. The system led to rapid social and economic development based on the basic needs of the natives. The system reorganized the authority of the native courts. The native courts passed judgment based on the principles of traditional law, and the British officers merely regulated the punishment to make it humane. It brought the natives very close to the colonial administration through their traditional rulers. It led to the modernization of African traditional institutions. Demerit. It strengthened the divide and rule. Traditional rulers and the Western-educated elite were always kept divided. The educated Africans who were not traditional rulers were excluded from the colonial administration, who were better placed to fight for constitutional and economic development. It failed to train future leaders in the modern art of governing since traditional leaders were mainly used. The British used the policy to exploit Africans. Most of the uneducated chiefs were used as stooges since they did not understand the policies of the colonial government. It made traditional rulers represent the British more than their subjects. It made chiefs do dirty jobs for the British officers like supervising grass cutting under the rain, collecting taxes, etc. It slowed down decision-making because the British ruled through traditional rulers, while the subjects had to pass through their chiefs. The system encouraged regionalism and tribalism. Each traditional ruler ruled his area independently of the others.